Hey, you over there. Yeah, I see you. You're thinking about starting your own podcast, aren't you? Well, if you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. Let me explain because I have some experience here. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Yeah, that's right. You heard me. Totally free to record, edit, and distribute your podcast. It doesn't get any better than that. So download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
The Ohio State Reformatory, also known as the Mansfield Reformatory, is a historic prison located in Mansfield, Ohio. It was built between 1886 and 1910 and remained in operation until 1990 when a United States federal court ruling ordered the facility to be closed. While this facility was seen in a number of films, including several while the facility was still in operation, as well as TV shows and music videos, it was made famous by the film The Shawshank Redemption, when it was used for most of the scenes of the movie. Now, why am I telling you this? Because in the movie The Shawshank Redemption, the main character is wrongfully convicted of murdering his wife and her lover. And he spends decades in prison suffering the indignities of prison life and ultimately breaks out and is free. However, for the dozens and dozens of convicted persons, wrongfully convicted persons in the state of Ohio, there is no means for freedom except to fight their case over the appeals process. Yes, Ohio has a wrongful conviction problem. It is an atrocity. It is abominable. I'm going to get to the bottom of it. I've got some explaining to do. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. And welcome to episode 11 of Ayana Explains It All. Now that intro, the intro got into what I'm going to be discussing this week. And it's pretty funny because as I was typing this, I was thinking of all of the times that I had driven up and down I-71 south and north in Ohio and saw the signs for the Ohio Reformatory and Shawshank tours, and especially around, fall and Halloween, and how they give it kind of a spooky effect. You could maybe sleep over in it. It's all of these things that they offer, and it's really wild. And I thought, why would anyone want to sleep there? Why would anyone? I know it's a landmark. It was used in a movie that's very famous, but why would anyone want to treat that as if it's something that's normal, to go there, to look at that, to see where people experience the indignities of being in prison, to see where people experience probably the last years of their life? It's morbid to me. It's macabre, but I get it. It's an attraction. People want to see it. People want to understand it. But what people really need to understand is that the movie, while based on the mind of Stephen King, it really taps into a problem the state of Ohio has. Now, Ohio does not have the highest number of wrongful convictions in the country. That honor belongs to the state of California, with New York, I believe, being next. But really, the more people you have, the more chances of having a wrongful conviction arise. But Ohio is in the top 10 with 94 wrongful convictions exonerated so far since they began counting in 1989. Prior to 1989, I believe it had 30, somewhere along the lines of 30, 33. So I wanted to start this episode of Ayana Explains It All on Ohio's wrongful conviction problem with the story of Isaiah Andrews. On April 10th, 2022, 83-year-old Isaiah Andrews died. Isaiah Andrews was a remarkable person, but for a tragic reason. His name is famous. His story is famous. He is written down in history for doing something extraordinary, and that is being third on the list of the longest prison sentences served for a crime he did not commit. In the National Registry of Wrongful Convictions, there is his name. He served 45 years after a jury found him guilty of murdering his wife. Isaiah and his wife Regina were newlyweds of only 2 months when someone murdered her and left her body in Forest Hills Park, a park that covers Cleveland Heights and East Cleveland, Ohio, and whose grounds once served as the mansion grounds of John D. Rockefeller. But Isaiah Andrews did not have nearly the notoriety, wealth, esteem, and education of Mr. Rockefeller. For their honeymoon, Isaiah and Regina stayed at the Colonial House Motel, at the time 5 miles west of Forest Hills Park. Isaiah was not at the motel at the time of his wife's disappearance, but on August 26, 1974, when he returned to find her gone, he alerted a maid and then contacted her family, none of whom had seen or heard from her that day. Isaiah filed a police report. Her family filed a police report. Later, a man found Regina's body in the parking lot of the park, and police formally identified her on September 19, 1974. Of course, her husband, Isaiah, was the prime suspect in her murder. Most women, in fact, are murdered by an intimate partner. However, as in this case, police zeroed in almost immediately on the partner and to the exclusion of all other relevant, known, possible suspects, decided who they wanted to be responsible, and made the evidence prove their charges. But charges follow evidence, not the other way around. Still, Isaiah had the unfortunate luck of being a recently paroled federal convict. Though he served in the Marines, he was convicted of murdering his drill sergeant after an argument. Still, he served his time. He was released and free to live his life. He was a Muslim, specifically a Black Muslim, and certainly these factors played a role in his conviction. When questioned, some witnesses gave vague recollections of seeing Isaiah around the motel, at his car, carrying a heavy bag. The hotel used the same bed linens found on and around Regina's body at the time her body was discovered, and after their second interview of Isaiah, police arrested him for his wife's murder. Ultimately, after a trial, he was convicted of aggravated murder by a jury in the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. A judge sentenced him to life in prison. Now, the evidence used to convict him was not all of the evidence. In a criminal case, this is like Criminal Procedure 101, we know that exculpatory evidence must be disclosed to the defense, that withholding evidence may subject a lawyer to disciplinary action. It is misconduct. The jury panel did not hear exculpatory evidence because prosecution did not disclose that police had a different suspect. Someone staying at a hotel that used linens found on and around Regina Andrews' body, that they had questioned him, interviewed alibi witnesses for him, conducted an entire investigation, and alerted the prosecution to this. But the prosecution did not disclose this to the defense. And on top of that, there were lying eyewitnesses. And if the jury had heard this evidence, all of the evidence, it certainly would have found Mr. Andrews not guilty of the murder of his wife, Regina. One awful, ugly, intentional decision changed his entire life forever. And it is unfair. It is a travesty. It is an abomination of justice. It is the reason so many people have little faith in the justice system, and in fact call it the injustice system. Isaiah Andrews was one of, so far in the state of Ohio, 94 exonerees. 56 of those defendants were Black, 84 male, 10 female. And in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, which has the highest number of exonerees at 30, wrongful convictions is an expensive and embarrassing blight on a system that serves the people. It is disgusting. It is unfathomable. And in the case of Nancy Smith and Joseph Allen of Lorain County, Ohio, the crime they were convicted of did not happen. Miss Smith, at the time of her arrest, was a Head Start bus driver. She was convicted of sexually abusing children in her care. She, along with her co-defendant, Joseph Allen, were convicted and sentenced to prison. In February 2022, a Lorain County Court of Common Pleas judge granted motions for a new trial, and the prosecutor asked that the charges be dismissed immediately. Yes, the allegations were false. The allegations were made up. They were lies. They spent decades in prison for crimes that did not happen. Just like Mr. Andrews, Miss Smith, Mr. Allen, Joe D'Ambrosio, an honorably discharged U.S. Army veteran, was wrongly convicted of murder and sentenced to death in 1989 for the murder of Tony Klan. And after 2 decades on death row, he was exonerated and now works to end the death penalty in Ohio and across the country. Many of these cases have been brought to light by the Ohio Innocence Project of the University of Cincinnati School of Law. The Ohio Innocence Project has helped 34 individuals seek and find exoneration from prison sentences for crimes they did not commit since its founding in 2003. Isaiah Andrews was one of their clients. After he tried unsuccessfully to have his case overturned on appeal, he turned to the Innocence Project for assistance. Out of the 34 cases handled by the OIP, 14 originated in Cuyahoga County. Again, Cuyahoga County has the highest number of wrongfully convicted men and women in the state. Again, Cuyahoga County has the highest number of wrongful conviction exonerees in the state. One of Mr. Andrews' caretakers after his prison release, Mr. Charles Jackson, was a man who spent 27 years in prison for a murder and attempted murder he did not commit. A terrible bond they shared. Decades of life loss, enduring the indignities and torture of prison. Lost time with family, loved ones, opportunities for thriving and making a mark on this world lost, brought together by a dreadful truth of our criminal justice system. Not that we get it wrong when it comes to convictions, but that there are people actively working to make sure that we do not get it right. Both Andrews and Jackson's bids for a new trial hinge on prosecutors not disclosing evidence favorable to their cases. Someone decided they were going to build a case around a defendant versus finding the defendant that the evidence led them to. Now, in some cases, there are witnesses who do lie. And so that becomes evidence that police rely on that leads them to a defendant who may or may not have committed the crime, certainly. But it's law enforcement's job to vet these people out, to check alibis, to make sure that the people who said they saw this person are correct in what they saw. Sometimes police are so eager to have someone arrested for the crime that their due diligence falls away. It is typically new evidence that leads to the reopening of the case, that leads to an exoneration. Typically, new evidence. Sometimes it's DNA evidence. Sometimes someone confesses, although when a person confesses to committing a crime that someone is serving time for, it doesn't necessarily lead to the case being reopened. And when I say new evidence, I mean new physical evidence. They don't necessarily care that witnesses recant, that jury members feel regret, that other people have come forward and said that they did it. They want to see actual new physical evidence that the person convicted of the crime is likely not the person who committed the crime. Prosecutors, in fact, struggle to accept the erroneous conviction.
In researching the topic for this podcast, there was something I never thought to consider, and that is the feelings of the prosecutor and the judge. Forgot to reconsider how they might feel about having to free an innocent person, about having to make the decision to retry a case or let it go, about having to reimburse someone for time they spent in prison. It never occurred to me to consider that they might feel some kind of way about the job that was done. Because you see, we're supposed to just stick by their decisions. We're supposed to uphold the integrity of these people who are usually elected by us, the judges and the prosecutor. In most states, they are elected. We're supposed to just accept their decisions. Let them pass by. Let the person who was convicted, let the conviction stand. There is a strange murder case out of Summit County, Ohio. Some of you may have heard of this. It's the Dennis Praed case. Dennis Praed was convicted of killing his ex-wife. His conviction hinged on bite mark evidence. That is, the bite mark left on his wife was matched to his teeth. His conviction, which he fought for years, ultimately came before an appeals court. And in January 2013, a Summit County Common Pleas judge ruled that DNA evidence exonerated him. That is, evidence excluded his genetic markers from the bite mark on his ex-wife's arm. But then an appeal from the Summit County Prosecutor's Office, in that case, Sherry Bevan Walsh, who's been the prosecutor in Summit County for some years, her appeal of that decision sent him back to prison in late 2014. Ultimately, a Summit County Common Pleas judge determined that Mr. Praed did not present new evidence. Remember, new evidence, warranting a new trial, and he is in prison serving his original sentence, but is eligible for parole in August 2025. Now, in his case, bite mark evidence has now been considered junk science. It was made famous first in the Ted Bundy case, where a forensic odontologist testified that he matched bite mark impressions left on the victims to Ted Bundy's teeth. Now, how can you do that, you say? I don't know. I'm not a scientist. But also, a lot of scientists said it, and apparently they didn't know either. Apparently, they had no idea what they were talking about. And the method has been discredited, and you have to wonder, though we know he was guilty of murdering those women that he murdered, was he guilty of murdering all of them? But he was a monster and he's dead now, so what can you do? I think there's a show on Netflix about that. Forensic odontology. It's probably in one of those how to convict a murderer or something documentaries on Netflix. I remember watching that going, so okay, so these cases, there are cases where people were convicted of crimes based on science that is now discredited, but some of these people are dead. Some of these people were put to death. How do you undo that? How do you undo that? And you may find it difficult to believe that it is possible. In the case of Mr. Prade, it is very possible that the person who was stalking the victim is not the person who murdered the victim. It's very possible that Ted Bundy murdered some women, not all of the women he was accused of murdering. I know it's strange. It's very strange. It's very strange. But it is possible that a person recently released from prison for murder is not the one who later murdered his wife. There are instances where people are killed by someone who is not the one torturing them, or the likely suspect in the case. It's not always the husband. It's not always the girlfriend. It's not always the mom or the dad. Sometimes it is a stranger. Sometimes it is someone they interacted with briefly. Sometimes it's not the intimate partner. But those are the people that the police look at first. They look at the intimate partner. They look at the mom and dad. In the case of Melissa Lucio, who's on death row in Texas, the Innocence Project is highlighting her case because I believe there are 12 days left until she is scheduled for execution. She was convicted of killing her daughter, and it's very clear to me and to a lot of people, scientists, people who were on the jury, convicted her, witnesses, her other children, her family. It's very clear that the death was an accident, that Melissa did not murder the child. But police always look at the parents. Those are the people they zero in on. They zero in on the parents and the partners at the exclusion of all other evidence, all other suspects. But there are times also where they will invent suspects, right? There is a show on Netflix called The Innocence Files, and I watched this. It's based on the work of the Innocence Project, and I watched this extremely angry, extremely angry. Watch it, you'll be angered as well. There's a case of a young man who never been in trouble, never whatsoever had been in trouble. And somehow he ends up being convicted of serial rape. And he spends decades in prison for rapes he did not commit. But that one of the victims swore he is the man she saw who raped her. Somehow police made it fit. Somehow they made it fit. And then they tied him to all these other rapes. Somehow he had never been in trouble. He, in fact, had not raped anyone. But it took years, decades for him to get out of prison, for him to be exonerated. His entire life, his entire youth, his entire life gone. because of a mistaken identity. Is it mistaken identity if it's willful? I mean, they brought the woman into his house and said, "Is this the guy?" I mean, it seems willful to me. It doesn't seem like it was a mistaken identity, but they wanted it to be that guy and they made it fit. But accepting that there are mistakes made or that people do things intentionally to get away with, to cover up their own crimes, to cover up incompetence or to make their numbers look good, certain number of convictions you got to get. They'd like 100% of the crime solved. And the closest you can get to 100%, they love it. Never mind that mistakes are made. But this is the reason we have appellate courts. Because sometimes we get the conviction wrong. We get points of law wrong. We misuse or misunderstand evidence. We convict with little evidence. There's juror misconduct. Jurors sometimes confess that they got it wrong. Victims, witnesses don't tell the truth. So we have appellate courts to take a second, third, fourth, etc. look at the case. Those appeals can take, again, decades, because there are so many other appeals waiting to be heard. And if there isn't even if witnesses lie, even if police are duped into believing someone committed a crime, it's not enough. It takes a deeper, closer examination sometimes to have a case reopened. And that was what happened in And that is what happened in the Lucas Bray operation case. In 2005, in Mansfield, Ohio, the U.S. Department of Justice began the Lucas Bray operation to take down. It wasn't to take down drug kingpins and drug dealers. At first, it was to solve the murder of Timothy Harris on December 31st, 2004. Harris was a convicted felon who had spent much of his life in prison, and he was murdered supposedly by drug dealers. The Richland County Sheriff's Office investigated his murder as a drug dealer-related crime because the tips were hot in that direction. The Sheriff's Office decided to use drug dealers to help them solve the case, and in the meantime, they would establish a reputation for being tough on drug crime. It's important. This put them squarely at odds with the Mansfield Police Department, who was already established in fighting drug crimes in their community. The sheriff's office chose Jarrell Bray to be their lead informant, their lead undercover informant, and Lee Lucas, a U.S. DEA agent working undercover, to help them catch Harris's murderer. And in the meantime, put some drug dealers away. Mansfield police warned them against using Bray, and the office did not listen. And unfortunately for the U.S. Department of Justice and the Summit County and the Richland County Sheriff's Office, Mr. Bray, because he is a criminal, not to be trusted, he decided to run a game on them and finger his rivals, while Lucas used the case to essentially accelerate his career, although Lucas has now been hailed as the innocent victim in all of this. I mean, he was letting Bray run around with whomever and whatever just to get these people put in prison. In fact, one of the people he fingered was his rival, his main rival in the drug dealing business, Michael Frost, his former friend.
Despite being no closer than when they started to catching Harris's killer, the operation brought attention, adulation, money, funding, etc. to Richland County and Mansfield, Ohio. Bray fingered dealers to the sheriff's office, and they racked up arrests and convictions. No one, seasoned veterans, no one suspected Bray of lying to authorities until the defense attorney whose client was not going to accept a plea in his drug case, decided to ask the Department of Justice for a polygraph on Bray. Now, a polygraph had not been administered on Bray, even though he was someone who seemed like he was dishonest, but they trusted him. So because they trusted him, they did not do a polygraph. It is their practice to administer polygraphs to informants whom they consider to be untrustworthy. They didn't do that in the Bray case. In fact, Lucas didn't alert them at all that Bray was possibly running a game on them. And if they had done even the most routine of investigations, such as surveillance, they would have discovered on their own that Bray was lying to them and getting people jammed up. 18 people pled guilty. One of the supposed ringleaders was acquitted, which was strange, right? Considering that Bray, their star witness, had all of these other people fingered and they were taking pleas and going to prison. And here it was, this guy was acquitted. So, let's take a closer look at Bray. And then another guy says, I'm not going to take a plea. Let's take a closer look at Bray. They finally take a closer look at Bray, and what happens? Ultimately, Bray was convicted of civil rights violations and perjury. A federal judge, in an unprecedented move, vacated 15 cases, releasing 15 people from prison, exonerating 15 people from drug and other related offenses for crimes they did not commit. Yeah, Bray was saying that he had made deals with people that had never been made. He was saying that he knew so-and-so was doing this and doing that, and instead of investigating, they just took his word for it, and then they would take people and say, hey, you know what? We got you. We got a witness who says that they know what you've been up to. We've got a witness who says that they did this deal with you for so-and-so amount of money. Our informant said that they were doing business with you. It's in your best interest to take a plea. And this is what they did. This is how a lot of people get jammed up, actually. They are, I wouldn't say forced to accept a plea, but they are steered very heavily in the direction of a plea bargain because trials take time. And if you can't make bail, maybe you're in prison, maybe you're in jail awaiting your trial, like the man who was ultimately the undoing of Bray. He was in jail for 20 months awaiting his trial. And maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to take a plea so that you can just get your time over with. But even if you take a plea, if you didn't do it, you didn't do it, period. Even if you take a plea, you can still have your case examined, looked at. You can still have your case appealed. There are still grounds for appeal, even if you take a plea. And they're hoping you'll take a plea. In 2019, the Serial podcast, made famous by the Adnan Syed case, in season 3 of the podcast, they
the journalist took a close look at Cuyahoga County courts. The journalist took a look at the local courts, including in East Cleveland, Ohio, and Euclid, Ohio. And they looked at incarceration rates, and they examined the plea bargain structure. And it's maddening. It's maddening and it's sad, because they also talked about instances of police brutality. They talked about the failure of the Cuyahoga County jail. It's where a lot of people serve small sentences. It's some people who are waiting to be transferred to another prison. It's people who are awaiting trial. It is notorious. It has been investigated by the Department of Justice. At this time, Cuyahoga County is considering remodeling. Well, not remodeling the prison, they're building a new one. Instead of dealing with the issues of the current jail system, they're going to build a new one. I guess if you make a new place to violate people's civil rights, it looks less violating. I'm not sure. But in listening to the stories from suspects, defendants, their lawyers, and prosecutors on this serial podcast, it is clear that police and prosecutors are concerned with swiftly closed cases. They want to win, not necessarily get it right. But they assume that in their win, they're getting it right. But some of the time, they're not getting it right. However, they offer plea deals because the expense of a trial is, well, expensive. Experts, time on the calendar, the judge's time, you have to convene a jury panel, you have to bring in witnesses, you have to get witness statements. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money, and instead of doing that, hey, why don't you just take this plea deal for 2 years, 10 years, however many years, no years. You just have to be on community control for a little while, and it wraps it up for them, and it gets them out of the case. It moves the case on, moves it on. It's done, wrapped up. And then there's the case of public defenders. Public defenders are not paid as well as private defense attorneys. They're not paid enough to do as good a job as you perhaps need them to. They are not staffed well enough. The offices are not staffed well enough or funded well enough to handle large murder trials. And so sometimes people don't receive the representation that they are entitled to under the law. But it's not their fault also if police hide evidence. It is also not their fault if the prosecution does not disclose evidence that could be helpful to their client. The system we're working in is not designed to catch mistakes. And it leaves defendants, families, and communities torn apart when these convictions occur, when these wrongful convictions occur, and the reasons for them revealed. In fact, the top reasons for wrongful convictions, according to the National Registry of Exonerations, it could be one or typically a cluster of these factors: perjury or false accusations by others at 60% of the convictions, official misconduct at 55%, wrong eyewitness identifications at 28%, false or misleading forensic evidence at 24%, or false confessions at 12%. Wrongful convictions have grave ramifications for several dozen people on average each year, and in fact, the National Registry has tracked 2,749 wrongful convictions in the United States since 1989. DNA-based exonerations lead the pack, no surprise there. These morally and financially expensive injustices perpetuate and clog up the appeal system. Cuyahoga County, for its part, has instituted a conviction integrity unit with a threshold for accepting cases. The CIU policies, which were restructured in July 2020, state that a person's claim in Cuyahoga County must not be solely a legal issue that was previously raised or could have been raised at trial or during the appellate process. In addition, new and credible evidence of innocence must exist. Again, ding! New and credible evidence of innocence must exist. Applications can be filed only after all state appeals and post-conviction petitions are exhausted, which could take years. It could take decades. And claims from applicants who plead guilty are evaluated in rare and extraordinary circumstances. So, if you plead guilty, in rare and extraordinary circumstances, will they agree to review your case? In February 2013, the Ohio Supreme Court Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor convened a new Ohio Supreme Court task force on wrongful convictions that, quote, would analyze current practices and recommend improvements to further its standards of justice. I do not know what they've accomplished because the last time they met was in November of 2021, and it is April 2022. And before then, they had met at least once a month. And it just seems like the work has slowed. Not sure why. Can't blame anything on COVID anymore, so. But then again, a lot of the work that needs to be done to prevent erroneous convictions has to be done at the local level. It is sometimes a problem of local law enforcement. It is sometimes a problem of the local prosecutor and needs to be addressed locally as well as at the state. Ohio has 88 counties, but only 3 conviction integrity units in the state. 1 in Cuyahoga County and in Summit County and in Franklin County, where the seat of the state of Ohio is, Columbus, Ohio. So 88 counties and only 3 conviction integrity units. What do we hope to solve with throwing minimal resources at the problem? You cannot solve a problem as big as erroneous convictions when the work being put into it is minute. And I understand funding is a problem and finding attorneys to do the work is a problem, but also the problem that they're finding is that the units are not as objective in their work as they should be. They are tied to the prosecutor's office. They need to have oversight boards to ensure the integrity of their work. So yeah, there has to be an integrity oversight of the conviction integrity unit. Because of the mixing of interest here, it's like having police investigate police shootings. It's having prosecutors who work in the prosecution's office investigating prosecutions. It's not going to work. There needs to be an objective, independent body handling these cases. I applaud the creation of conviction integrity units. They do not go far enough. Conviction integrity units are aimed squarely at criminal justice reform. Fine, yes, I get it. But it's hard to come by when the community is not in support of these measures. And they have only recently gained bipartisan support. The more we see the importance of having these units, the more we see wrongful convictions being brought to light, the more we see exonerations, the more we see people seeking remuneration for time spent in prison, the more we see it, the more we want the problem to go away, and so we want to work together to eliminate it. Court News Ohio discussed integrity units in its article Writing Wrongful Convictions, noting that defense attorneys and Innocence Projects lack the funding and resources to take on and tackle every case brought to their offices. But these units face some rub against them because the very presence suggests that prosecutors get things wrong, and admitting it and living with the agency investigating it takes swallowing your pride. Also, these units have to be structured somewhat apart from the prosecutor's office, and they have to be objective bodies and have oversight boards. The author, Kathleen Maloney, identifies factors essential in remedying wrongful convictions. Number 1, updating criminal procedure and evidence rules. 2, ongoing education and training for prosecutors, particularly on the prosecutor's requirement to turn over any evidence favorable to the defense. 3, ensuring a post-conviction right to counsel. That right there is so important. The attorney that you have for your trial is not necessarily the attorney you want for your appeal. And in fact, isn't someone who is trained in handling appeals. Addressing post-conviction statutes, and correcting convictions that relied on junk science. Junk science, bite mark evidence, remember? Correcting convictions that relied on junk science should be like, there should be a unit in every state that looks just at those cases, because I'm sure there are hundreds of them, if not thousands of them. There are a couple cases in Ohio that I did not have time to get into. There are so many that I could be sitting here for days, weeks talking about them. But I want you guys to check out, as I said, the Innocence Files on Netflix for a dramatic look at several key cases of the Innocence Project. Also, check out the case of David L. Harrison out of Auglaize County, Ohio, and the East Cleveland 3 out of Cuyahoga County for breathtaking, astonishing exoneration stories. There are so many, so very many. And Wrongful Conviction Day is October 2nd. And most exonerations come to light only because of the extraordinary efforts of people who work outside of the system. For instance, lawyers working pro bono, family members, students, law school students. Yes. Law school students work on the Innocence Project of the state of Ohio. Law school students sometimes help law professors in examining cases.
in investigating unsolved murders, but also in erroneous conviction cases. But without cooperation from prosecutors in preventing and righting these erroneous convictions, fixing the problem will be almost improbable. The assault on defendants' civil rights, constitutional rights, must end, however. So please support the work of the Innocence Project and other nonprofit organizations working on ending wrongful convictions and helping defendants win new trials or exoneration in their case. Please vote smart when it comes time to elect a prosecutor or a judge in your county. In Cuyahoga County, the same people are elected over and over and over and over and over and over and over. It is the same names. It is the same type of people, if you know what I mean. It is the same people of the same background. We're tough on crime, tough on crime, tough on crime. Well, you know what? I don't want to always hear tough on crime. Sometimes I want to hear about the integrity of the office. What are you going to do to reform the integrity of the office? What are you going to do to reform the system that you want to work in or that you are already working in? Yes, criminal justice reform is important, not just to right the wrongs, but to prevent the wrongs from even happening. We have to get ahead of these problems because the years and amount of money it takes to undo a wrongful conviction is staggering. You wouldn't even believe how someone could be on death row for 30 years, how someone could be in prison for 42 years for a crime they didn't commit, how someone could be in prison for decades for a crime that never even happened. It is unfathomable. And in the state of Ohio, it is only getting worse. These numbers are not going to stall. They're not going to grow stale. With the advancements in criminal justice reform and the reexamination of junk science and the reexamination of cases because of DNA evidence, I have a feeling there are going to be more exonerations. But also, with these conviction integrity units, if we can get more money funneled into them and more lawyers willing to work on them and more counties willing to institute them, perhaps then we can eliminate, well, you can't eliminate it. Whatever. You can't eliminate this problem because witnesses lie. And while the evidence doesn't lie, yeah, police lie, lawyers lie, defendants lie. There's mistake of fact, there's a mistake of law, there are all these mistakes that could happen that could result in someone being erroneously convicted. So it may not be preventable, but it can be prevented. It may not be preventable, but it can be held off. It can be reduced. It can be stalled. So look into the Innocence Projects in your state. Look into wrongful convictions in your state. I only focused on Ohio because it's really bad here. And I feel like I could do a show on every state in the union, but certainly Mr. Andrews' death is the reason why I'm talking about this today. And the things that I uncovered in writing the script for today's podcast, for this podcast, is that there is pushback against exonerees who are seeking remuneration for the time they spent in prison. And in fact, there has to be, in some states, there was legislation that had to be passed to reimburse people for time they spent in prison. Some people would just get, a gift card and see ya
later don't come again from prison officials. Yeah, some states you got nothing. And certainly you languished in prison because if you got sick in prison, the health care isn't the best. So if you got out of prison and you were still fighting, there are some defendants who died waiting for their new trial, waiting for new evidence to be heard in their case. And in the case of Mr. Andrews, he passed away just a few weeks after he had been fully declared exonerated. And we don't want this happening anymore. We don't want it to get to the point where people are dying waiting for justice. And certainly victims and their families deserve to know exactly what happened to them. They deserve to know exactly who harmed them, who murdered their loved one, who raped them, who is responsible for robberies and accidents. They deserve to know. They deserve closure. And wrongful convictions just open up wounds that they had already either tried to deal with or were never really able to deal with. This just makes it worse. Because once a conviction is overturned, if no one else is presented as the perpetrator of the crime, the case is now open. The case is open. A case that may have been heard 30 years ago is now reopened, and it's open. And some law enforcement officials and judges and prosecutors will go to their grave saying, I don't care what jury said. I don't care what an appellate court said. So-and-so is guilty, and that's it. So it's hard for all involved. And so anything that we can do to make sure this does not happen, we should be doing it. But as I said before, vote smart. Don't just look at a person's name and click a box. Don't stay home on election day. Get out the vote. Go out there and vote. Vote for someone who is for criminal justice reform because it's not a scary thing. It is, in fact, a good thing. Don't just vote for someone who is tough on crime because tough on crime sometimes means that you ignore the right thing to do. Vote for someone who is balanced. Someone who is balanced. And I believe in the state of Ohio, I don't think they have postponed the primary. I know there was some going back and forth because of the redistricting maps being unconstitutional, but there's an election happening this year. There are midterms. There are prosecutors running for office. There are judges running for office. Make sure you get out the vote and do the right thing.
You have been listening to Ayana Explains It All, brought to you by Facts, Figures, and Enlightenment. The following resources were used in the making of this episode of Ayana Explains It All.
The article, Writing Wrongful Convictions by Kathleen Maloney, published in March 2021 at Courtnewsohio.gov. 2. The Ohio Supreme Court Task Force on Conviction Integrity and Postconviction Review at supremecourt.ohio.gov/boards/CIPR. 3. The article, Ohio Innocence Project Helps Lorain, Ohio Woman Clear Her Name 27 Years After Wrongful Conviction. Lorain County Judge Throws Out Conviction of Nancy Smith, by Cedric Ricks at uc.edu/news/articles, published on February 25th, 2022. The article, Mansfield Drug Case Gone Wrong, The Inside Story, by John Kroll of The Plain Dealer, published on June 22nd, 2008. The article, Ohio Prosecutors Struggle to Accept Wrongful Convictions, by Adam Lee Newman of NewmanLawOffices.com. The article, In Wrongful Conviction Cases, Prosecutors Don't Get In Easily on Guilt and Compensation, by John Caniglia of Cleveland.com, published on February 4th, 2013. And of course, the National Registry of Exonerations at www.law.umich.edu/special/exonerations. Thank you.